Okay, so the second type of learning and conditioning we're going to talk about is operant conditioning. And this is basically learning by an organism making a response in order to obtain a reward of some sort. This was first kind of theorized by Edward L. Thorndike in his Law of Effect, but it was really first studied and pioneered by B.F. Skinner, who's known for the Skinner box. Now, the Skinner box itself was basically just a box with a lever and a slot for food to come out. And what Skinner did was he essentially taught rats to perform specific behaviors by having food come out. And that goes along with the term of shaping, where the rat eventually was rewarded for getting near the lever, so he'd get a food pellet for that. Then touching the lever, eventually he'd get a reward for that. And then finally he'd only get rewarded for actually pulling the lever, which is obviously an unusual behavior, not a natural one for rats to perform. And so shaping is basically specifically making an organism perform a specific behavior. The different kinds of reinforcement that are, reinforced through operant conditioning are primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are just the obvious ones like food and water, whereas secondary reinforcement is things like money, which obviously doesn't have any necessarily intrinsic value. It's just kind of a secondary way to get a primary reinforcer. Okay, so I'm just going to go over some more vocab terms basically that have to deal with operant conditioning that you definitely want to know. Positive reinforcement, that's the addition of a stimulus to increase the likelihood of a certain behavior taking place. For example, food pellets for the rat pulling the lever. Obviously, adding that stimulus, the food, is going to reinforce the behavior of the rat to pull the lever, just like a paycheck for money encourages people to do work. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, does reinforce behavior, but it's because you're removing a stimulus. For example, rats on an electric floor, for example, if you removed the electricity, that's by pulling a lever, you're going to reinforce the action of pulling the lever because it took away the negative stimulus, the electricity, which is obviously painful. So for some more terms related to this concept, for schedules of reinforcement that you'll want to know, continuous, this is basically any kind of, reward for any correct response. So just say every time you pull the lever, you get a pellet. That would be continuous reinforcement. Fixed ratio is kind of similar, but it's not for every correct response. Say it's for every 5 correct responses. So every 5 times that the rat pulls the lever, you get a reward. That would be fixed ratio. Variable ratio is a little bit different. You're going to want to know that variable ratio and variable interval schedules of reinforcement are the best for, maintaining behavior. They're less susceptible to extinction. But anyways, variable ratio is after a certain amount of responses, but you don't know how many. So for example, the rat could pull the lever 3 times, or they could pull it 10 times. That's the variable ratio example there. Another example of this would be slot machines. You pull the slot machine however many times, but you never know when it's actually going to pay out. And so, like, a variable ratio kind of keeps people doing that sort of behavior because they never know when they're going to get the outcome they want. Fixed interval is kind of like fixed ratio, but instead of number of responses, it's just an amount of time. An example of this would be a paycheck. You get paid every 30 days or whatever, like a monthly paycheck. That's on a certain interval every month, and so it's fixed. Variable interval, that's an amount of time that you don't know how much it's going to be. For example, a teacher giving pop quizzes. You don't know when that's going to take place. You just know that it's going to be at a certain amount of time. A couple other quick terms related to this would be a token economy. That's basically just an artificial economy based on tokens, so that has to do with reinforcement. They do that in prisons or things like that, where the tokens could be used for primary reinforcers such as food. Another term you're going to want to learn is learned helplessness. That's basically when you keep giving responses, but you don't get any sort of reward. Um, so that would eliminate eventually the likelihood of you giving any responses if you're not getting any sort of reward.